So today is the 27th day of Tevis, the 27th of January, and we ended last time with seeing in the soul, in the psyche, what it means to speak without a feeling of self. That was what the Baal Shem Tov wanted from all his tzaddikim, all his disciples who became rabbis. And now he says that in every person's everyday learning, this also exists. And that's when we learn halacha. Why halacha? Because then a person is not speaking from what he understands and what he feels, but rather from what Hashem puts in his mouth. Now, the main example of this, we haven't gotten into him yet. Actually, we've mentioned him already. But the person who's most malchus, who's most identified with the moon, who's most identified with speech, is David, King David. He's the epitome of malchus. He's the beginning of malchus, really. There's a very interesting thing about him that the sages say, "Vayihi David ish matzliach," that he was a successful man. It says that halacha ke David b'chol makom. That halacha is always like him. In whatever thing that he ruled, and he was also a tremendous scholar, so in everything that he ruled, halacha followed his ruling. Not because he was a king, but rather because what people realized was that he's the person who's least speaking from himself. And we mentioned him before that he's our hero of Rosh Chodesh. Like whenever we talk about, like before we were talking about Yaakov and Moshe, and now we're talking about David. And together they spell the word miyad, Moshe, Yaakov, David. It's a big deal by the Rebbe, this word miyad, because it says techef umiyad mamash, right? That the geula should come techef umiyad, immediately. In fact, when you think about it, I don't know if it's related in any way, but in English, immediate, you hear the mem yodalid in it. I don't know what the reason is, if there's any kind of mediate. I mean, so here the idea is that when you speak halacha, it's the least coming from you, and it's supposed to be entirely coming from Hashem. It's Hashem's will, not yours. Moshe katuv udvarai shel samti b'ficha lo yamushu mipicha. This is in Isaiah 59:21. The words that I put in your mouth, they shall not move from your mouth. They should always be in your mouth. And there's a beautiful example of this in recent generations, of someone who's in this state of saying what Hashem tells him to say, as it were. Like he's not, and in fact he's usually the only example we have in these generations, in the past, let's say 20 generations, of a person who was speaking entirely from what Hashem told him to speak, and that was the Beis Yosef. And the Beis Yosef, he has a whole book that he wrote about it called Magid Meisharim. And what he used to do is, with the Alshech, Moshe Alshech, they used to sit Friday nights after the meal, after the Shabbos meal, they go to the Beis Medrash, and they'd recite Mishnayos by heart. More and more and more. They do this for hours. And they did this for a number of years. I don't remember how many years he says. It's something like 10 or 15 years. Not very long, but not short. It didn't happen overnight, but it didn't take the whole lifetime. And sometime when he was, I think, in his 50s, the Alshech would fall asleep. Usually he would fall asleep in the middle, and the Beis Yosef would move into a transient state where he would start speaking without knowing what he was saying. And at first he didn't even have a documentation of it, because nobody was awake in the Beis Medrash in the middle of the night to document it. But then the Alshech began waking up, and he heard him. So they started documenting it. Motzei Shabbos, they used to write what they heard from him. And they questioned this Magid, this angel that was speaking through the Beis Yosef. And they told him, I am the Mishnah that you've been reciting. Because you've been reciting Mishnah again and again and again and again, so, and you know by heart, so the angel of the Mishnah came out and started speaking in him. And it's interesting, that's the only real example we have of this in the past so many generations, of a Magid that comes out through speech. And it happened to the Beis Yosef. Why is this relevant here? Because he's one of the greatest halachists in legal authorities in the past generations. So one has to connect with the other. There's a whole idea here that people don't talk about enough. In science today, at least in brain science and neurology, the understanding is that the brain creates connections. The synapses between the cells and the neurons in the brain are formed when you use them. So they have all these statements like neurons that fire together, wire together, right? That if they fire at the same time, then they begin to create connections. The whole way that this is all seen as something very physical, very completely material. But when you repeat something many times, that's exactly how you create these connections. Like if I'm using my hands in a certain way. So over time, my hands become automatically, they do those motions by themselves. That's how a gymnast trains. That's how you learn how to touch type and everything that you do. So the same thing is true by Torah learning. That if you repeat something many, many times, this was just in the Tanya a couple of days ago, if you repeat something many, many times, you begin to wire your brain a certain way. Now, wiring the brain, again, is something very physical, very material. But everything in the material world has a parallel in the spiritual world. So when you're wiring your brain together, you're wiring your neurons together, you're also wiring your body to your soul in a certain way. That's like where the connection is. So the fact that people don't have so much of a feeling of their inner spiritual world is because they're haphazard. They're jumping all over the place. If you would take one topic and seriously repeat it many, many, many times, you would begin to connect to the spiritual behind that topic. And that's what happens, I think, to doctors and to anybody who has a serious profession where they do things many, many times. They begin to call it they're in the zone, they're in somewhere else, and something else is happening. It's not just the fact that this is natural to me, but all the more so when you're talking about Torah. So this idea of the Beis Yosef is just repeating the Mishnah again and again and again. What he unlocked was the Magid in the Mishnah. It's like there's a Magid, there's an angel in these texts. But you have to unlock it. And the way you unlock it is you wire your brain a certain way by repeating it again and again until it comes out, until your body is connected to that spiritual realm. So really the Mishnah that was talking in him, that's what he said, Aniya Mishnam Daberet Beficha, was he himself. It wasn't like something came from outer space. It was he himself, but it was a level of his existence that he couldn't reveal any other way. This was the way to get to it. Okay. Which is, by the way, why doing automatic speech or stuff like that is usually meaningless. Because people are saying something that's not a wiring. It's the opposite. It's almost like taking away from any kind of order, you're trying to just say random nonsense and gibberish. And then they because they very much want a spiritual connection, so they hang on that and they say, I had a spiritual experience. The Christians love this. I don't know why. But anyway, the real way to do this is to invest yourself in a text and to know it very, very well and to repeat it many, many times. Every person needs to have, the Maggid used to say there are 10 things that a person needs to know by heart. One of them is Ha'azinu, to know Ha'azinu by heart. Ha'azinu is an incredible, it even says, Ve'anta shira azot bahem, that this song, the song of Ha'azinu, the end of Deuteronomy, will answer them. Like the song itself will be a voice inside of them. So okay.
That's what something that AI cannot do. AI cannot connect.
Right. To that level, it can't connect at all. Right. But that's your job. There's many things that come out of these connections, because a lot of times the associations are amazing. Like Reb Nachman. Reb Nachman is the product of another person who repeated things many hundreds of times. That was how he studied when he was a child. He used to just repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. And that's what he handed out to his disciples also, to learn the entire Torah every year. How can you learn the entire Torah every year? It's like, that was the precursor to the Reb Chaim, what's his name?
Before the wedding specials, we'll go through the whole.
They go through the whole Torah
Shas,
every year,
with,
not just the Shas.
I've heard this without any.
Without understanding.
Right.
And the Shulchan Aruch and the Zohar and the Mishnah and everything every year. So Reb Chaim was the same way. He had this whole thing, but he understood. He tried to understand. Reb Chaim Bnei Brak, Kanievsky.
So about the Gra. He met someone who was studying them when he was a Gan Ladim or something. And he said to him, how did you become the Gra? He said, because I took seriously Me'er Pa'amim. You did.
Because I repeated 100 times everything. וכמו כן למעלה בראש חודש מקבל את המלכות שהיא דבר השם מן השכל והחוכמה ומדבר את מה שהוא שם בה מחוכמתו יתברך ואז הדיבור בבחינת ביטול. It says the same thing can happen every Rosh Chodesh to every person because the dibur, the malchus, is going all the way up to Abba, to the mind, and is receiving directly without the zah. So it's without the zah, it means it's without a sense of self. It's just what Abba says to it. וזהו שנקרא ראש חודש השם התחדשות מוחין חדשים מחוכמתו יתברך בעולם הדיבור. That's why it's called Rosh Chodesh. Because Rosh Chodesh literally means a new head. So what's the new head here? The new mindset, the new mind that the dibur, that the speech receives when it goes up to wisdom by itself. והנה יש בזה גם כן העלאה והמשכה. So there's two things that are happening here. It says it's a dynamic. On the one hand, there's an elevation, ha'ala'ah, but there's also an amshachah, there's also a drawing down. פירוש העלאה הוא מה שהדיבור עולה ונכלל בחוכמה תחילה. So the elevation is the speech elevating to the level of wisdom. So what is that? That we already explained. That's the bittul. That's when the person cuts out the ego. We'll see this in a moment. He'll explain a little bit better. But then once you've cut it out, then there has to be a drawing down. That's the mal at the end that we talked about 2 days ago. 2 days ago? I think 2 days ago. That the mal at the end is already speech, which is a drawing down of something new. Hu giluy chokhmah b'dibur, which is a revelation of the wisdom that he gained now in his speech. As long as one's speech is full of oneself, the feeling of self, he can't receive from chokhmah directly. But he first has to nullify himself in order to go up to Abba. והוא, כמו על דרך משל באדם המדבר, שצריך לגלות עמקות השכל בדיבור, אזי הוא פוסק מלדבר ומעמיק בשכלו איך לדבר. So this is we see in a person who needs to now say something that's much deeper than what he planned on saying. He has to actually go deeply into his thoughts. So then he has to stop speaking. He has to stop speaking. That's the chash that we said. First of all, be silent. If you're silent, then you can connect to the wisdom. And then, so by the way, there's also a little bit of this on Shabbos. Okay? On Shabbos also we're not supposed to speak. It says "Bekoshi yitiru ledaber b'Shabbat." That on Shabbos they hardly permitted us to speak. Why hardly? Because they wanted us to speak only the very Torah and only tefillah, only the davening, and only things that are kodesh. But in the end, they saw that people couldn't handle it, so they permitted it. But it was bekoshi. Why? Because in the same way that Hashem, when He created the world, for 6 days He spoke, and then the 7th day He rested. What did He rest from? From speaking. He didn't say anything. So if He doesn't say anything, where is He going? He's not. Nothing's going on. Of course, something's going on. He's going back to the thought. He's going back to where everything came from, to the origin of everything. Okay. So in the same way, when a person stops speaking, he goes back to the origin. לגלות עמקות השכל בדיבור. אזי הוא פוסק מלדבר ומעמיק בשכלו איך לדבר. והוא עניין עליית הדיבור בחוכמה. And this is what we call the elevation of speech into wisdom. וכן עניין שתיק רב שנזכר בגמרא. The same thing we see in the Gemara many, many times. But the famous one is the Rav was asked a question about a halacha, he said. And he said, I know that this is true, but I don't remember how. So he had to fall silent. Shatik Rav. He fell silent until he remembered. And then by Moshe Rabbeinu, Hashem says to him that be silent, that then rise to speech, to thought. Okay. we'll end here.
Good.